William Carter spent his life denying God, convinced that faith was nothing more than a crutch for the weak. A renowned scientist and outspoken skeptic, he built his legacy on reason and logic until the night he lay dying. In those final hours, with eternity pressing close, he uttered a confession that sent shivers down Pastor Elijah's spine. "I saw him. I've always known." How could a man who spent decades rejecting God admit to something so profound? What had he seen? And more importantly, why had he kept it buried for so long? As Elijah wrestles with his own doubts and the town scoffs at William's deathbed revelation, one question lingers. Can grace reach even the hardest heart before it's too late? What if everything William spent his life denying was the one truth he could not escape? Before we continue with the story, take a moment to subscribe. Grab a coffee or your favorite drink as we journey into the depths of God's love, where faith is tested, prayers are answered in unexpected ways, and miracles unfold when we least expect them. Stay with us, because this story will reveal just how powerful faith can be. Pastor Elijah stirred awake to the sharp ring of his phone, his heart pounding in the quiet darkness of his small study. He rubbed his weary eyes before glancing at the clock, 2:17 a.m. With a deep sigh, he reached for the phone, already bracing himself for bad news. "Pastor Elijah?" The voice on the other end was soft yet urgent. It was Sarah, the night nurse from St. Luke's Hospital. "I'm sorry for calling so late, but there's a patient here. William Carter. He's in his final hours, and he's asking for a pastor." Elijah hesitated, running a hand through his tousled hair. He knew the name well. William Carter, the renowned scientist, the relentless critic of faith, the man who had openly dismissed God for decades. Why now? Weariness tugged at him, but something deeper, something unseen, compelled him to rise. Within minutes, he was in his car, the empty streets stretching endlessly under the dim glow of streetlights. By the time he stepped into William's hospital room, the weight of impending death was suffocating. Machines beeped softly, casting a rhythmic pulse into the stillness. William lay frail and pale against the stark white sheets, his once sharp eyes now dulled by time and suffering. "You wanted to see me?" Elijah's voice was gentle, cautious. For a long moment, William said nothing, only staring at the ceiling as if trapped between past regrets and an uncertain eternity. Then, with a raspy breath, he turned his gaze to Elijah, and in the hushed quiet of that dimly lit room, he whispered, words that sent chills down Elijah's spine. "I saw him. I've always known." Elijah felt his breath catch at William's words, his mind racing to grasp their meaning. He took a cautious step closer, searching the dying man's face for deception, but all he saw was raw, unfiltered fear. The machines hummed steadily in, the background as William licked his dry lips, his fingers twitching against the blanket. "I saw him, Pastor," he whispered again, his voice hoarse but urgent. "Years ago, I should have told someone, but I was too afraid." Elijah pulled up a chair, his pulse pounding with an odd mixture of disbelief and anticipation. He had spent years preaching to men like William, skeptics who mocked the very existence of God. And yet here he was, on the edge of eternity, speaking of an encounter that had haunted him for decades. "Tell me," Elijah urged, his voice steadier than he felt. William swallowed hard, his gaze drifting toward the dim hospital window, where the stained glass reflections of the chapel cast flickering colors against the wall. "I was young. It was an accident. I drowned, or at least I should have. The water was so cold, and I remember sinking. I thought it was over, Pastor. Then I saw him. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths, eyes shining with unshed tears. He reached for me, Elijah. Jesus himself. But I turned away." His voice broke, and for the first time in decades, A sob escaped the man who had once scoffed at the very idea of faith. Elijah sat frozen, his mind unable to form words. William's fingers gripped the bedsheet tightly as he forced out the next words. I buried it. I built my life on science, logic, and pride. But I knew, deep down, I always knew. His body trembled and a look of anguish crossed his face. I need to tell someone before it's too late. Elijah leaned in, his pulse quickening as William struggled for breath. The air in the hospital room felt heavy, charged with the weight of an unspoken truth buried for decades. William's fingers trembled as he grasped at the memories, his voice barely above a whisper. I was 16, he began, eyes clouded with the ghosts of his past. It was winter, and the river was frozen over, or so I thought. I was reckless, testing the ice, laughing at danger like young boys do. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing with the effort. I fell through. The cold was like knives, stabbing into my lungs, pulling me under. I fought, but the current was too strong. Darkness closed in, and I knew I was dying. His eyes flickered to Elijah's, pleading for him to understand. Then I saw him, a light, warm and golden, breaking through the water. A hand reached, for me. His hand. A tear slipped down his sunken cheek. I knew who he was. There was no doubt, no question. It was Jesus. His voice cracked as he turned his face toward the ceiling, blinking rapidly. But I was proud. Even in death. I hesitated. I let the fear of ridicule, the weight of my father's atheism, and the mockery of my friends hold me back. I refused his hand. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. William's frail body trembled, his breathing uneven. Next thing I knew, I was on the riverbank, coughing up water. A fisherman had pulled me out, but I never told anyone what I had seen. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks in my final moments. But it wasn't. I know that now. His fingers clenched the blanket as a ragged sob tore from his chest. I saw him, Pastor, and I turned away. Elijah sat back in his chair, his mind reeling as William's confession settled over him like a heavy fog. He had prayed for years to witness a miracle, to see undeniable proof of God's power break through the hardened hearts of unbelievers. Yet now, faced with this very moment, doubt slithered into his thoughts. Why would God reveal himself to a man like William, a man who had spent a lifetime denying him, while Elijah had spent years preaching and seeing so little fruit? The questions gnawed at him, unsettling his spirit. William, exhausted, let his head sink back against the pillow, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. I should have taken his hand, he murmured. I should have spent my life telling the world, but I buried it. His lips trembled as he closed his eyes. Now it's too late. A lump formed in Elijah's throat. He wanted to tell him it wasn't, that grace could still reach him even now, but the words felt hollow in his mouth. With a tight nod, he stood, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. I need to pray, he said quietly, more to himself than to William. Stepping out into the dimly lit hallway, he exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. The hospital was eerily silent at this hour, the faint hum of machinery and distant footsteps the only sounds. He paced toward the small chapel at the end of the hall, his heart pounding. Lowering himself onto one of the wooden pews, he buried, his face in his hands. Lord, I don't understand, he whispered. I have spent years asking for revival, and now this man, this skeptic, says he has seen you. Why him? The silence pressed in, offering no answer. Frustration tightened his chest. Was his faith so weak that he could not rejoice in a soul finally turning back to God? Taking a slow breath, he forced himself to remember the truth he had preached so many times before. God's ways were higher. His mercy was boundless. Even the most stubborn heart was never beyond his reach. As the weight of his doubt lingered, a soft knock at the door broke through his thoughts. He turned to see Sarah, standing there, her expression unreadable. "Pastor," she said softly, "William is asking for you. We carefully crafted this story, and we truly appreciate your support. More than that, we've prayed that the Holy Spirit will touch your heart in ways only He can. Subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with someone you love." Now, let's return to the story. Elijah's steps were slow and measured as he returned to William's room, his heart still wrestling with the turmoil of his own doubt. The dim hospital light cast deep shadows on the frail man's face, accentuating the years of stubbornness and regret etched into his features. William's fingers fidgeted with the thin blanket, his gaze distant, lost somewhere between past and present. "Pastor," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion, "I spent my life convincing myself that faith was nothing more than a crutch for the weak." He exhaled shakily, eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I built my life on knowledge, on reason, on proving that men like you were wrong." His fingers curled into a fist. "But I was the fool." Elijah remained silent, letting the weight of William's words settle. The beeping of the monitors filled the space between them, each pulse a reminder of time slipping away. "I had everything, Pastor," William continued, his voice thick with regret. "Degrees, accolades, respect. People listened when I spoke. They called me brilliant, a man of reason. But none of it mattered." His breath hitched as he met Elijah's gaze, desperation flickering in his eyes. "I was empty. I spent my whole life running from the truth I knew deep in my soul." He swallowed hard, voice cracking. "And now I am out of time." The confession hung between them, heavy and unshakable. Elijah felt the familiar pang of urgency stir in his chest. William had spent a lifetime denying the God who had once reached for him. But was it too late? He took a slow breath, stepping closer. "You are still here," Elijah said, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. "And as long as you are breathing, God's grace is not beyond your reach." William's lips trembled, his hands gripping the blanket tightly. "Do you really believe that?" His voice was barely above a whisper, laced with something fragile, hope or fear. Elijah could not yet tell. The pastor nodded, conviction settling into his bones. "I do." William's gaze dropped to his hands, and for the first time in years the great skeptic sat in silence, considering the possibility of mercy. The next morning, as the sun cast a pale glow over the town, Elijah sat in the church office, his fingers drumming restlessly against the wooden desk. Sleep had evaded him, his mind replaying every word William had spoken. The dying man had admitted to seeing Christ, to knowing the truth all along, yet the weight of his denial had crushed him for decades. Elijah knew this was the kind of testimony that could shake the town, the kind of story that could pierce even the most stubborn hearts. But as he sat before the gathered church elders, their skeptical expressions made his own faith waver. "Deacon," Harold adjusted his glasses, his lips pressed into a thin line. "A deathbed confession?" he said slowly, his voice tinged with doubt. "Pastor, you of all people should know that a dying man will say anything when he is afraid." A murmur of agreement rippled through the small group. Elijah tightened his jaw, feeling the familiar sting of resistance. "This is not just fear," he countered. "William Carter has spent his entire life denying God. He did not call me to his bedside out of desperation. He called me because he saw Christ and buried the truth for years." Elder Thompson sighed, rubbing his temples. "Even if that is true, what does it change? The man is dying. He has spent a lifetime speaking against faith. You really think people will believe he suddenly had a change of heart?" The words stung, but Elijah knew the deeper truth. Some hearts were so hardened that even a miracle before their eyes would not move them. Frustration gnawed at him, but before he could respond, a quiet voice broke the tension. "I believe him." All heads turned toward the doorway, where Sarah stood, her hands clasped in front of her. Her gaze was unwavering as she stepped forward. "I have watched that man fight against God for years," she said. "And last night, I saw something I have never seen before. He was afraid, yes, but not just of dying. He was afraid of what he had run from all his life." The room fell silent. Elijah saw the flicker of uncertainty in some of their eyes, the quiet battle between skepticism and possibility. He leaned forward, his voice steady. "If God can reach a man like William Carter, then there is no one beyond his mercy." The elders exchanged glances, but no one spoke further. As the meeting adjourned, Elijah caught Sarah's eye, gratitude flickering between them. As they stepped outside into the crisp morning air, she whispered, "You need to go back to him, Pastor." Elijah nodded, determination settling in his chest. William's story was not over yet. Elijah walked through the hospital corridors, the weight of the morning's conversation still pressing against his chest. The town would not believe easily, and perhaps some never would. But William's soul was not a debate to be won. It was a battle already waged in the depths of his own heart. As he reached the hospital room, Sarah was there, adjusting the blankets around the frail man's frame. She glanced up, relief evident in her eyes. "He has been waiting for you," she said softly. Elijah stepped forward, watching as William stirred, his face pale against the pillow. His eyes flickered open, and for the first time since their meeting, there was something different in them, a quiet surrender. "You came back," William murmured. Elijah nodded, pulling the chair closer. "I am here." Silence stretched between them before William spoke again. "She has been praying for me, you know," he said, his voice weak. "For years." His gaze shifted to Sarah, and the nurse smiled faintly, her hands still resting on the edge of the bed. "Every night," she confirmed, "even when you mocked me for it." William let out a soft, breathless chuckle, though it carried no humor. "And yet you never stopped." Sarah shook her head. "Because I knew that one day God would break through." Elijah swallowed the lump rising in his throat. He had always believed in the power of prayer, but to see it in motion, to witness the slow breaking of a heart that had resisted for so long, left him humbled. William turned back to Elijah, his expression unreadable. "Tell me," he whispered. "Is it really not too late?" Elijah leaned forward, his voice firm with conviction. "God's mercy is greater than all the years you have run from him. His grace does not run out." William's lips parted as if to speak, but instead, his eyes glistened with something raw and vulnerable. Elijah could feel it, the unseen battle in William's soul reaching its breaking point. The pastor took a deep breath. "Do you want to pray?" The old man hesitated, his frail fingers twitching against the sheet. Then, with the faintest nod, he whispered, "I do not know how." Sarah reached for his hand, and Elijah bowed his head. "Then I will help you." And in that small, dimly lit hospital room, years of resistance began to crumble under the quiet persistence of grace. William's lips trembled as he tried to form the words, his breath shallow and uneven. Elijah could see the weight of a lifetime pressing down on him, the unspoken grief of years wasted in denial. His fingers curled weakly around Sarah's hand, as if clinging to the last thread of hope. "I have spent my whole life running," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I have mocked, ridiculed, torn apart everything that pointed to him. And now, at the end, I see the truth." His throat tightened, and he turned his face toward the dim glow of the window. How could he still want me after everything? Elijah's heart ached at the rawness in William's words. He had seen regret before, had heard confessions of sorrow from those who had lived without faith, but something about William's brokenness ran deeper. It was not just guilt. It was the torment of knowing he had seen the light once and willingly turned away. Elijah leaned closer, his voice gentle but firm. Jesus did not come for those who had it all figured out. He came for the lost, the broken, the ones who thought they had run too far. He let the words settle before continuing. Look at the thief on the cross. He had nothing to offer, no time to make amends, and yet Christ welcomed him into paradise. William's breathing hitched, his sunken eyes glistening with unshed tears. I could have had a life with him, he choked out. Instead, I spent it rejecting him. Sarah squeezed his hand. And yet, he still brought you here. Silence filled the room, thick with the weight of what was unspoken. William closed his eyes, his body trembling as though battling the years of disbelief that had kept him prisoner. When he spoke again, it was barely more than a whisper. Is there still time for me, Pastor? Elijah's throat tightened. He reached out, placing a hand gently on William's shoulder. As long as you have breath, there is time. A tear slipped down the old man's cheek, and for the first time in decades, William Carter let the walls around his heart begin to crumble. Elijah reached for his Bible, his fingers tracing the worn leather cover as he turned to a familiar passage. The room remained silent, except for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the occasional rasp of William's breath. The old man's eyes, once sharp with defiance, now held only exhaustion and a fragile flicker of something deeper. Hope. I want to read you something, Elijah said gently, flipping through the thin pages. He stopped at Luke 23, his voice steady as he read. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But the other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God, he said. Since you are under the same sentence, we are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Elijah paused, watching as William's lips parted slightly, his breath coming in uneven bursts. Jesus answered him, Truly, I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise. The words hung in the air, sacred and unshakable. William swallowed hard, his fingers twitching against the blanket. Just like that? His voice was barely a whisper. Elijah nodded. Just like that. A deep shudder ran through William's frail body as he stared at the ceiling, his brows furrowing in thought. He did not have time to fix his life, William murmured, more to himself than to Elijah. He did not make amends. His voice cracked. And yet Jesus took him. Elijah leaned in, his voice unwavering. Because salvation is not about what we can do. It is about what he has already done. A tear slipped down William's cheek, his breath hitching. I have spent my whole life believing I was too rational for faith, he whispered. But now, at the end, I see that reason was never the problem. It was my pride. Elijah remained silent, letting the moment unfold. William's chest rose and fell, his eyes flickering with something unspoken. Then, in the quiet of the hospital room, he whispered, I want to believe. Elijah felt his heart stir at William's words, but he knew that belief was not always immediate. Even now, on the edge of eternity, the old man struggled with the weight of a lifetime spent resisting God. William's fingers clutched at the thin hospital blanket as his breathing grew uneven. I want to believe, he repeated, his voice raw. "But what if I cannot?" His gaze flickered toward Elijah, searching, pleading. "What if I have spent too many years convincing myself that he is not real?" The question settled heavily between them. Elijah had seen this before, the final battle of the heart, when a man stood at the threshold of faith, but feared stepping through. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Faith is not about having every doubt erased," he said gently. "It is about choosing to trust, even when questions remain." William's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "And what if my heart cannot?" Elijah's fingers tightened around his Bible. "Then ask him for help," he said simply. Even the man who stood before Jesus and wanted healing cried out, "Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief." William's lips parted, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Help my unbelief," he echoed softly, the words feeling foreign yet somehow right on his tongue. The battle raged within him, decades of denial warring against the quiet, persistent call of grace. He looked away, his chest rising and falling, with shallow breaths. "I do not know how to let go," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Elijah reached forward, his tone unwavering. "Then let him do the rest." The old man exhaled shakily, his fingers loosening ever so slightly from their grip. In the stillness of the room, with eternity drawing near, the walls around William's heart continued to crack. William lay motionless, his frail chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, his eyes distant as if staring into a place Elijah could not see. The battle in his soul was not against death, but against the weight of his own unbelief. His fingers twitched against the blanket, his lips parting as if forming words that would not come. "I want to believe," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "but I do not know how." Elijah leaned closer, his heart pounding. "You do not have to know how," he said gently. "You only have to come." William's breath hitched, his fingers tightening into a weak fist. "It cannot be that simple." His voice cracked, thick with years of self-inflicted barriers. Elijah's voice softened. "It is that simple, because it was never about what you could do. It has always been about what he has already done." William's lips quivered, his frail body trembling beneath the weight of it all. His entire life had been built on reason, on logic, on evidence. But here, at the end, none of it mattered. His past achievements could not save him. His intellect could not comfort him. Only grace could. His eyes fluttered shut, his throat tightening. "What if I am too late?" Elijah took his hand, the gesture firm yet filled with compassion. "You are not." The room felt impossibly still as William's fingers weakly curled around Elijah's own. His breath was labored, his voice barely a whisper. "Then tell me what to say." Elijah bowed his head, his voice steady as he led him. "Lord Jesus, I know I have spent my life running from you." William's lips moved, the words barely audible, but they were there. "I have denied you, rejected you, but now, at the end, I see the truth." A tear slipped down his sunken cheek. "Forgive me." His grip on Elijah's hand tightened ever so slightly. "I do not deserve your mercy, but if you will have me, I surrender." Silence filled the room. Elijah felt his own breath catch as he opened his eyes. William lay still, his chest rising and falling with quiet exhaustion. But something was different. His eyes, once filled with torment, now held something else. Peace. William lay in silence, his frail body still trembling from the weight of the words he had spoken. His breath was shallow, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, yet there was something in his expression that had not been there before. A quiet release, a surrender. Elijah let out a slow breath, feeling the sacredness of the moment settle over them. William's fingers twitched slightly, his voice hoarse. "So, that is it?" His tone was not doubtful, but full of wonder. "That is all he asks." "Of me?" Elijah nodded, his grip still firm on the old man's hand. "Yes, that is all." He reached for his Bible once more, flipping to the passage they had read earlier. The thief on the cross had nothing to offer, no time to change his life, and yet Jesus told him, "Today, you will be with me in paradise." William swallowed hard, his breath hitching as he turned his face toward Elijah. "Then that means he has taken me too?" His voice broke at the last word, and for the first time, tears slipped freely down his cheeks. Elijah smiled gently, nodding. "Yes, William, he has." A soft sob escaped from the dying man's lips, his body shuddering under the weight of it all. A lifetime of regret, of denial, of running. It all fell away in that single moment of grace. Sarah, standing quietly at the foot of the bed, wiped at her own eyes. "Angels are rejoicing," she whispered. William let out a weak chuckle, though it came out more as a breathless sigh. "I never thought I would see this day." His voice wavered, but the fear that had once lingered in his tone was gone. He closed his eyes, his breathing uneven but steady. "I am so tired." Elijah gave, his hand a reassuring squeeze. "Rest, William, you are finally home." The room was quiet, except for the steady hum of the machines and the soft rustling of the wind against the hospital window. William's breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of his chest slower than the last. Yet in his face, there was no longer fear, no longer the weight of a man carrying decades of denial. Instead, there was peace. His fingers twitched against the blanket, and with effort, he turned his gaze toward Elijah. "I never prayed before," he murmured. "Not truly." His voice was weak, yet there was something steady beneath it, something different. "I do not know if I am doing this right." Elijah leaned in, his voice gentle. "There is no right way, William. Just speak to him. He has been waiting to hear your voice." A deep breath rattled through William's frail body as his lips parted. "Jesus, if you are still there, forgive me." The words were barely more than a whisper, yet the weight of them filled the room. A tear slipped down the old man's cheek, his body trembling as though releasing something he had held onto for far too long. "I do not deserve this," he choked out. "I have wasted so much time." Sarah, standing quietly by the bedside, wiped her eyes. "Time does not measure grace," she said softly. "It was never about what you did or did not do. It was always about him." William's breath hitched, his lips pressing together as another tear fell. For the first time in decades, he had nothing left to argue, nothing left to resist. His body weakened, but his heart had finally let go. Elijah placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice filled with quiet certainty. "You are forgiven, William." A soft exhale escaped the dying man's lips, his eyes fluttering shut. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his face. "Then I am ready." News of William Carter's sudden change spread faster than the morning light breaking over the town. By the time Elijah left the hospital, whispers had already begun to stir in coffee shops, on front porches, and among those who had once admired William's sharp mind and unshakable skepticism. The scientist, the man who had spent his life dismissing faith, had asked for a pastor. The same William Carter who had debated preachers and written against Christianity had spoken the name of Jesus with his final breaths. Some dismissed it, outright, shaking their heads with knowing smirks. "A dying man will say anything when he is afraid," they murmured. Others, however, were not so sure. At the church, a small group of young believers sat huddled after the morning service, their voices hushed but eager. "Could it be true?" one of them asked. "Did William Carter really give his life to Christ?" Another hesitated before speaking. "I heard that Nurse Sarah was with him, and she said he prayed." The weight of that possibility settled over them, the idea that a man so opposed to faith could change in his final moments. Meanwhile, among the elders of the church, skepticism reigned. Deacon Harold folded his arms tightly, his voice heavy with doubt. "People are desperate when they are dying," he said. "What proof do we have that this was real?" Elijah, standing at the back of the room, took a slow breath. He had expected resistance. He had known that not everyone would embrace the miracle that had unfolded before him. But as he stepped forward, his voice was steady. "I was there," he said. "I saw a man who had spent his life running finally stop. I saw the peace on his face when he let go of everything and surrendered to Christ." The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. After a long pause, Deacon Harold shook his head. "Do not get your hopes up, Pastor," he said. "Some things cannot change." But as Elijah turned to leave, Sarah caught his gaze, her eyes filled with quiet certainty. "I believe him," she whispered. And for Elijah, that was enough. The following Sunday, the weight of William Carter's confession still hung over the town like a thick morning fog. Whispers filled the church before the service, hushed voices trading opinions like passing offerings. Some believed that God had done the impossible, that even the hardest heart could be softened in the final moments of life. Others remained skeptical, their doubt woven into the very fabric of their reasoning. As Elijah stepped to the pulpit, he could feel the tension. Before he even spoke, his usual sermon notes lay untouched beside his Bible. Today was not a day for rehearsed words. "Many of you have heard the news," he began, his voice steady. "William Carter, a man who spent his life rejecting faith, surrendered to Christ before he passed." A murmur rippled through the congregation, some nodding, while others exchanged doubtful glances. Elijah let the pause settle before continuing. "Some of you are asking if it was real. If a man who spent his entire life rejecting God could truly find salvation in the final moments." His gaze swept across the room, landing on Deacon Harold, who sat with his arms folded. "I have asked myself the same question," Elijah admitted. "But then I remembered the thief on the cross." He turned the pages of his Bible, his voice unwavering. The thief had no time to change his life, no time to prove his repentance. Yet Jesus told him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Silence stretched through the room, thick with unspoken thoughts. Finally, a voice from the back broke through. "But how can we know for sure?" The words hung in the air, spoken not with malice, but with genuine uncertainty. Elijah's lips pressed together in thought before he spoke. Because salvation has never been about what we can see. It has always been about what God sees in the heart. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then slowly, a few heads nodded. A few hearts softened. But not all. As Elijah stepped down from the pulpit, Deacon Harold remained still, his expression unreadable. Elijah knew the battle for belief was not yet won, but he also knew that faith had never needed the approval of men to change lives. Days passed, but the debate over William Carter's final confession did not fade. Some clung to their skepticism, unwilling to believe that a lifetime of rejection could be undone in a moment of surrender. Others, however, found themselves wrestling with a deeper question. If God could forgive William, what did that mean for them? Elijah sat in his office, staring out the small window as rain drizzled against the glass. He had spent years praying for revival, pleading for hardened hearts to turn to Christ. Now, he was watching it unfold in ways he never expected. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Sarah stepped in, her expression unreadable. "I thought you should know," she said quietly. "William passed early this morning." Elijah exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling over him. "Was he at peace?" Sarah nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "More than I have ever seen him." She stepped closer, lowering her voice as if holding something sacred. Before he closed his eyes for the last time, he whispered, "I am not afraid anymore." Elijah felt his throat tighten. The man who had once scoffed at faith had left this world unafraid, resting in the grace he had once denied. As Sarah turned to leave, she paused. "It is strange," she murmured. "People always talk about death bringing fear, but for him, it brought peace." Elijah sat in silence long after she left, his hands clasped together on the desk. The peace William had found was not born from reason, not from logic, not from a lifetime of good deeds. It had come from surrender, from accepting the mercy that had waited for him all along. As Elijah bowed his head in prayer, he whispered the same words that had carried William home. "Thank you, Lord. He is not afraid anymore." William Carter's passing left a strange stillness over the town, as if even those who had doubted now sensed the weight of something beyond themselves. The man who had spent his life fighting against faith had left this world with peace, and that alone was enough to unsettle many. At the hospital, a quiet stream of visitors trickled in throughout the day. Some came out of respect for the legacy of his intellect, others out of curiosity, trying to understand what had changed in his final moments. Elijah sat beside the bed where William had once lain, his Bible resting open in his lap. Across from him, an older man adjusted the collar of his coat, his expression unreadable. "I knew William for over 30 years, the man said at last. "We built our careers together. He never wavered in his beliefs." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Or at least, that is what I thought." Elijah watched him carefully. "People can spend their entire lives building walls against God," he said. "But sometimes, all it takes is one moment to realize those walls were never strong enough to keep him out." The man's fingers tightened around the arm of his chair. "So, you really believe it was real? That after everything, he just changed?" Elijah met his gaze, unwavering. "I do." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, the man sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I do not know what to think." His voice was quiet, almost lost in the hum of the hospital machines. Elijah closed his Bible gently. "Then ask yourself this," he said. "What if William was right in the end?" The man did not answer, but the flicker of doubt in his eyes told Elijah that the question had taken root. As the man stood to leave, his movements slow and contemplative, Elijah felt a quiet certainty settle in his heart. William's testimony was not finished. It was only the beginning. The funeral was small, held in the quiet chapel at the edge of town. Rain drizzled softly against the stained glass windows, casting muted colors onto the wooden pews. Those who gathered came for different reasons. Some to honor the brilliant mind they had respected, others to try and make sense of the man's final confession. Elijah stood at the front, his hands resting on the pulpit as he looked over the faces before him. There was a heaviness in the air, not just from grief, but from the weight of questions left unanswered. As he opened his Bible, a figure at the back caught his eye. A man sat alone, shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the floor. Elijah recognized him instantly. Dr. Jonathan Hayes, William's oldest friend and fiercest intellectual ally. The The service continued, hymns filling the air, words of remembrance spoken in careful tones. But when it ended, and the others filed out, Jonathan remained. Elijah approached quietly, giving the man space to speak first. After a long silence, Jonathan let out a breath, his voice strained. "I keep thinking about all the years we spent, laughing at people like you." He shook his head, his fingers gripping the edge of the pew. "And now I am wondering if we were the fools all along." Elijah studied him, seeing the war in his expression. The battle of a mind built on reason, now confronting something it could not explain. William regretted the years he spent running, Elijah said gently. But regret did not keep him from grace. Jonathan's jaw tightened. And what if I have spent too many years running too? The question lingered in the air, raw and uncertain. Elijah met his gaze, his voice steady. "Then stop now." The rain continued to fall outside, soft and unassuming, as Jonathan sat in silence. Night had settled over the town by the time Elijah returned to the church. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick with reflections of the dim streetlights. He stepped inside the empty sanctuary, the air thick with the lingering scent of candle wax and old wood. He needed a moment alone, a space to process the weight of the past few days. As he sank onto the front pew, his thoughts drifted back to William's last moments. The quiet surrender. The peace that had replaced years of resistance. Elijah had seen many deaths, had held the hands of both believers and skeptics as they crossed the threshold into eternity. But William's passing had been different. There had been no fear, no desperate clinging to the life slipping away, only peace. A soft creak of the door broke through his thoughts. He turned to see Jonathan standing in the doorway, hesitation written across his face. "You said something earlier," Jonathan murmured, stepping inside. "That regret did not keep William from grace." He exhaled slowly. "Do you really believe that?" Elijah nodded without hesitation. "I do." Jonathan swallowed hard, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. "I cannot stop thinking about it," he admitted. "If William was right in the end, if everything we dismissed was true." His voice trailed off, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Elijah studied him for a moment before speaking. "Then the question is not whether he was right." His voice was quiet but firm. "The question is, what will you do with that truth now?" Jonathan did not answer right away. Instead, he lowered himself onto the pew beside Elijah, staring ahead at the empty cross hanging at the front of the church. And in the silence, Elijah knew the battle had already begun. The morning of William Carter's burial arrived with a quiet stillness, the kind that made the world feel momentarily paused. The small cemetery sat just beyond the town limits, where rolling hills stretched toward the horizon. The gathering was modest, a mix of those who had known him personally and those who had only known his reputation. Elijah stood near the front, hands clasped before him as the casket was lowered into the earth. He had spoken many eulogies before, but this one felt different. He looked over the faces before him, some marked with grief, others with uncertainty. William Carter was a man of great intellect, Elijah began, his voice carrying over the hush of the wind. A man who spent his life seeking answers, challenging belief, and searching for truth. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. And in his final days, he found it. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Jonathan stood near the back, his posture tense, his expression unreadable. Elijah continued, "Some will say his confession came too late, that a lifetime of denial could not be undone in a single moment of surrender. But I stand before you today to tell you that God's mercy is not measured in years, but in grace. A murmur passed through the small crowd, some nodding, others looking away. Elijah let his gaze sweep over them, knowing that William's story was not just about him. It was about all of them. "None of us know the number of our days," he said, his voice steady. "But we do know that until our final breath, God's hand remains extended." As the service ended and people began to drift away, Jonathan remained. He lingered near the grave, staring at the fresh mound of earth as if searching for something unseen. Elijah approached, waiting in silence until Jonathan finally spoke. "He spent his whole life running from this," Jonathan murmured. "And yet, in the end, it was all that mattered." His voice was laced with something fragile, something hesitant. Elijah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It is never too late to stop running." Jonathan let out a slow breath, his gaze still fixed on the grave. And for the first time, Elijah saw something shift in his eyes. In the days following William Carter's burial, the town seemed to carry an unspoken question, one that lingered in quiet conversations and thoughtful glances. The man who had once been the most outspoken opponent of faith had died in surrender to it. What did that mean for those who had stood by his side, certain in their disbelief? Elijah saw it in the faces of his congregation, in the way some sat a little longer after service, their eyes distant with contemplation. He saw it in the hesitant steps of those who had never before set foot inside the church, but now lingered near its doors, uncertain but drawn by something they could not explain. The most surprising of all came one quiet afternoon when the sanctuary was empty, save for the flickering candles and the distant sound of rain against the roof. The door creaked open, and Elijah looked up to see Jonathan standing at the threshold. The man hesitated before stepping inside, his usual confidence replaced by something more guarded. "I have been thinking," Jonathan said after a long silence, "about everything." He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "I spent my whole life agreeing with William, convinced that faith was nothing more than a crutch. But if even he could admit he was wrong, what does that mean for me?" Elijah studied him carefully before speaking. "It means you are asking the right questions." Jonathan let out a soft, mirthless chuckle. "I am a man of reason, Pastor. I do not know how to believe in something I cannot prove." Elijah closed his Bible gently and met his gaze. Neither did William. And yet, in the end, proof was not what he needed. It was surrender. Jonathan's jaw tightened, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. The battle was still raging within him, but the seed had been planted. And that, Elijah knew, was how all faith began. Sunday morning arrived with a quiet expectancy, the kind that settled in the air before something unseen took root. The church was fuller than usual, not by much, but enough for Elijah to notice the new faces scattered among the familiar ones. Some came out of curiosity, others out of something deeper, a stirring they had yet to name. As Elijah stepped to the pulpit, his gaze swept over the congregation, pausing when he spotted Jonathan near the back. The man sat stiffly, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. He had not come to be convinced. He had come to listen. Elijah's heart stirred with something close to hope. He set aside his prepared sermon and turned the pages of his Bible with quiet certainty. "Many of you have heard about William Carter," he began, his voice steady. "A man who spent his life rejecting faith, but found himself unable to ignore the truth in the end." A hush fell over the room. The weight of those words pressing into the hearts of those who had known William best. "Some have asked if a deathbed confession is enough," Elijah continued. "If God truly welcomes those who come to him so late. But let me remind you of something." He turned to Matthew 20, his fingers running over the familiar verses. "The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. Some labored all day, others for only an hour. And yet, When evening came, they were all paid the same. He let the words settle before speaking again. Grace is not about how long we have labored. It is about who the Master is. He glanced toward Jonathan, watching as the man's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed on the floor. The battle was not over, but he was here. And for now, that was enough. The service ended, but Jonathan remained seated long after the congregation had begun to file out. He stared ahead, his hands clasped together, his mind wrestling with things he had never before allowed himself to consider. Elijah watched from a distance, sensing the unseen battle taking place in the man's heart. Slowly, he made his way over and sat beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of voices in the background faded as Jonathan finally exhaled, shaking his head. "I spent years admiring William's mind," he murmured. "We built our careers on logic, on facts, and yet in the end, he found peace in something I cannot explain." Elijah studied him carefully. "Does that trouble you?" Jonathan let out a dry chuckle. "It terrifies me." He turned to face Elijah, his expression clouded with uncertainty. "What if he was right? What if I have been blind this whole time?" Elijah leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Then the question is not about what you have missed. It is about what you will do now." Jonathan looked away, his jaw tightening. "I do not know how to believe in something I cannot prove." Elijah nodded. Neither did William. But belief is not about certainty. It is about surrender. Silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Finally, Jonathan rose to his feet, his hands still buried in his pockets. "I am not there yet," he admitted. "But I will be back." Elijah smiled. "That is enough for now." As Jonathan stepped out of the church, the sunlight breaking through the stained glass windows cast a quiet glow over the empty pews. William's story was still spoken, and for the first time, Elijah truly believed the revival he had prayed for was only beginning. The following week, Elijah sat in his office, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the wooden desk. He had seen Jonathan return to church, not yet willing to step beyond the back pew, but unwilling to stay away. It was a familiar struggle, the slow breaking of a heart that had been hardened for too long. A knock at the door pulled Elijah from his thoughts. He looked up to see Deacon Harold standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "May I come in?" the older man asked. Elijah nodded, gesturing toward the chair across from him. Harold lowered himself into it, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a slow exhale, he met Elijah's gaze. "I owe you an apology." The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of something long overdue. "I dismissed William's confession," Harold admitted. "I thought it was desperation, nothing more." He shook his head, his fingers tightening. "But I have not been able to shake it. The way you spoke at his funeral, the way Jonathan keeps coming back, even though he wants to pretend he does not care. It is as if something is happening, and I have been too stubborn to see it." Elijah leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle. "What is it that you see now?" Harold let out a slow breath. "That maybe I have spent more time judging souls than leading them." The admission hung between them, heavy, yet freeing. Elijah saw the quiet conflict in the deacon's face, the battle between pride and surrender. Finally, Harold closed, his eyes briefly before looking at Elijah again. "Pray for me," he said simply. "I think I have been missing something for a long time." Elijah nodded, his heart stirring with quiet gratitude. The revival he had prayed for was not coming in shouts or great displays. It was coming in whispers, in softened hearts, in the quiet breaking of walls that had stood for too long. Sunday morning arrived with an unusual stillness, the kind that carried expectation. The church was fuller than it had been in years, a quiet ripple moving through the congregation as familiar faces took their usual places and newcomers lingered near the back. Elijah stood at the pulpit, his heart steady, knowing something was shifting in ways only God could orchestrate. As the final hymn faded, he stepped forward, prepared to preach, but before he could speak, movement from the side of the sanctuary caught his attention. Deacon Harold stood from his seat, clearing his throat as he took slow steps toward the front. The murmurs in the congregation quieted as the older man turned to face them, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I have something to say," he announced, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "For years, I have been a man who followed the rules, who knew the scriptures, who believed I understood what it meant to be a servant of God." He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the faces before him. "But I see now that I have spent more time guarding traditions than opening doors for those seeking grace." A hush fell over the room, the weight of his words sinking in. When William Carter confessed his faith in his final days, I doubted him. I dismissed it as fear instead of recognizing the miracle right before my eyes. He shook his head slowly. "But God has been working on my heart, and I stand here today to say that I believe. Not just in the faith I have always claimed, but in the grace that meets a man, no matter how late, and welcomes him home." The silence stretched, thick with emotion, until finally, one voice spoke from the back. "I want that grace too." Heads turned as Jonathan stood, his expression unreadable, his hands gripping the back of the pew in front of him. His voice was quieter when he spoke again. "I do not have all the answers, but I am tired of running." A murmur moved through the room, some in shock, others in quiet reverence. Elijah's chest tightened with gratitude as he stepped down from the pulpit. "Then let us pray," he said, his voice filled with the certainty that this was only the beginning. The church was quite long after the last of the congregation had left, save for the soft flickering of candlelight and the weight of unspoken thoughts lingering in the air. Jonathan remained seated in the back pew, his hands clasped tightly together, his gaze fixed on the wooden cross at the front of the sanctuary. Elijah sat beside him, allowing the silence to settle before speaking. "You do not have to figure everything out at once," he said gently. Jonathan let out a slow breath, his jaw tightening. "I have spent my entire life dismissing faith," he murmured. "My entire career built on the idea that logic and science held all the answers." His fingers curled against the edge of the pew. "And now I am questioning everything." Elijah nodded, recognizing the familiar battle. "Faith is not the absence of questions, Jonathan. It is trusting in the one who holds the answers, even when we do not." Jonathan scoffed softly, shaking his head. "That is the problem. I do not know how to trust in something I cannot prove." Elijah studied him for a long moment before speaking. William spent his life believing the same thing, and yet, in the end, proof was not what he needed. It was surrender. Jonathan's expression faltered, his shoulders sinking slightly. "I saw the change in him," he admitted. "I saw the peace he had, and I cannot explain it." He exhaled, his voice quieter now. "But I want to understand." Elijah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Then keep asking. Keep searching. God is not afraid of your questions." Jonathan nodded slowly, his grip on certainty loosening just enough for something new to take root. Jonathan sat in his dimly lit study that night, surrounded by stacks of books and pages filled with years of research. The flickering glow of his desk lamp cast long shadows across the room, but his mind was fixed on something far beyond the walls lined with knowledge. He reached for an old leather-bound journal, one he had nearly forgotten about. It had belonged to William, His fingers hesitated before flipping through the pages, the familiar handwriting pulling him into the past. At first, the notes were as he expected: scientific observations, theories, calculations. But as he turned further, the writing became more erratic, almost hesitant. Then, in the center of a page, a single line stood out. "I saw him. I know he is real, but I am afraid." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He turned another page, his pulse quickening. "If I admit the truth, everything changes." He stared at the words, the weight of them pressing into his chest. William had known for years. He had buried the truth beneath reason, just as Jonathan had. He ran a hand over his face, a deep exhale escaping his lips. His entire life had been built on certainty, on facts and logic. But now, for the first time, he was beginning to see that certainty had never been the answer. Truth had been waiting all along, patient and unwavering. His hands trembled as he closed the journal, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Jonathan sat motionless, the weight of William's words pressing into his chest like an unseen force. The journal lay open before him, its pages filled with the quiet confessions of a man who had spent a lifetime running from the truth. He swallowed hard, his hands tightening into fists as he stared at the words once more. "I saw him. I know he is real, but I am afraid." The air in the room felt heavy, charged with something he could not explain. He had spent years debating against faith, dismissing belief as nothing more than a construct for the weak. Yet here, in the final words of the man he had admired most, was evidence that defied everything he thought he knew. His mind raced, grasping for something logical, something tangible to hold on to. But there was nothing, only the undeniable reality that William had seen something, no, someone, and had spent his life burying the truth. Jonathan's breath came in uneven bursts as he pushed back from the desk, rising to his feet with a sharp exhale. His hands raked through his hair as he paced, heart pounding against his ribs. "God, if you are real," the thought barely formed in his mind before he shut his eyes tightly, his pulse roaring in his ears. He could not bring himself to say it, not yet. His knees buckled slightly, but he caught himself against the desk, gripping the edges as if they might anchor him. And then, in the quiet of the room, in the solitude of a man wrestling with the weight of surrender, he let out a whisper, one he had never spoken before. "God, if you are real, I need to know." His voice cracked on the last word, the whisper barely audible. Silence followed, stretching endlessly, but something within him had shifted. The walls he had spent a lifetime building were beginning to crumble. Jonathan sat in the stillness of his study, his whispered plea hanging in the air like an unanswered question. But deep inside, something had shifted. The resistance that had defined his life, the walls he had built around his heart, were no longer impenetrable. He did not have the answers, but for the first time, he was willing to ask. Days passed, and Jonathan found himself returning to the church, not out of obligation, but out of something he could not yet name. He sat in the back, listening, observing, wrestling with his thoughts. He spoke with Elijah in quiet moments, challenging him with questions that carried more weight than mere intellectual debate. And then, one Sunday morning, he did something he never thought he would do. He stood. The congregation stilled as Jonathan stepped forward, his movements careful, deliberate. He reached the front, turning to face the people who had known him as a skeptic, a man who had once dismissed faith without hesitation. His throat tightened, but he spoke anyway. "For most of my life, I have believed that faith was nothing more than an illusion," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I convinced myself that truth could only be found in what could be measured, tested, proven. but I was wrong. A murmur rippled through the room, hushed and reverent. Jonathan's fingers curled slightly at his sides as he inhaled. William saw something decades ago that he spent his life trying to deny. And when I read his words, when I saw the change in him before he passed, I could not deny it anymore either. He swallowed hard. I do not have all the answers, but I know this. God has been calling me, and I cannot ignore him anymore. Silence filled the sanctuary, thick with the presence of something sacred. Then, slowly, one by one, people rose from their seats, some in tears, others with quiet, understanding in their eyes. The revival Elijah had prayed for was unfolding before him, not in grand gestures, but in hearts surrendering, one by one. And as Jonathan stepped down, his face turned upward, he knew he had finally stopped running. The cemetery was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the grass as Elijah stood before William Carter's grave. The words etched into the stone were simple, unadorned, yet they carried a weight that could not be measured. Once blind, but now I see. Elijah let out a slow breath, his heart full but heavy. So much had changed since that night in the hospital, since the whispered confession of a man who had spent his life denying the truth, only to embrace it in the end. The ripples of that moment had spread further than he ever could have imagined. Jonathan stepped beside him, hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the headstone. I used to think that death was the end, he murmured, that whatever came after was just a comforting story people told themselves. He let out a quiet exhale. But William knew the truth long before he was willing to say it. And now, so do I. Elijah turned to him, a small smile touching his lips. And what will you do with that truth? Jonathan was quiet for a long moment before answering. I think it is time I stop running. His voice was steady, certain. I do not know what comes next, but for the first time, I am ready to find out. Elijah nodded, his chest swelling with gratitude. The revival he had prayed for had come, not in the way he expected, but in the way only God could have ordained. As they turned to leave, a figure lingered near the entrance of the cemetery. A young man, hesitant, uncertain. He caught Elijah's gaze, then glanced at the grave before speaking. I knew William once, he admitted, his voice laced with hesitation. And I think I need to know more about what happened to him. Elijah's heart stirred as he stepped forward, the echo of William's final words still fresh in his mind. Tell them. He's real. He extended a hand, his voice filled with quiet certainty. Then let's talk. This story is a reminder that God moves in ways we may not always understand, but his love never fails. If this touched your heart, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that miracles still happen. All glory and honor belong to Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. Until next time, stay strong in faith and never stop believing.